Bruchim haboim. Welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Mem Amud Aleph. Start with Lamed Tes Amud Beis, the very last line. The Gemara continues to talk about things that can lead to chimutz. Says the Gemara Amar Rav Yosef, Lo lichlut inish trechiti bahadi hadodi. On top of Mem Amud Aleph, a person shall not scald two different kernels of wheat. In other words, he should not put two kernels of wheat together in the same boiling water. Why? Because maybe one will then come in contact with the second one, and the second one that has a groove in it, it will then stick to the second one. Why is that a problem? And then the boiling water, the scalding water, will not come in contact with all four sides of this kernel. And it will come to then result in chimutz. Abai said, Loi lichrich inish trei shibuli bahadadodi. A person shall not singe two stalks of grain together. Dilma nafki maye mehai ubola idach va'asil de chimutz. Because maybe one will have its juice go out from it, and then the other one will absorb the juice, and therefore it will come to be a problem of chimutz. Omar le Rav, Rav argues on Abaye. Ihochi asks, afilu chada nami nami dilma nafik mehai reishu bali idach reisha. Then even if it's just one stalk of wheat, that itself will then have the one end open up. The juice will come out, and it'll come to be absorbed in the other end of that stalk. Elomar Rava, rather Rava says it's not a problem because me peiros ninhu, ume peiros einan machmitzin. Here, there's no issue of chametz because the juice that comes out from the stalk is me peiros, and me peiros alone will not be machmitz. V'hoda be'abai me'ai. Now Abai was chayz from what he said, but not for the reason that Rava said. In other words, he does not agree with Rava that mei peiros is not machmitzin. Rather, he says the reason why it's not a problem to then take two stalks and singe them is because the following: the kol agav medal yohu lo mechamtze. Because so long as the juice is going to then be moving, it's not going to then cause a chimutz. The Omar Abai, for Abai said, Haychatzbo da avishuna schifo shori zekifa oser. If you have a jug of flour that you want to then bake in a tanur, so if that jug is inverted so that the opening of the jug is facing downwards, then there's no problem, it's mutter, because the juice would then be flowing downwards. It will never be nidvla inside of the rest of the flour. But if it's upright, where the mouth is on the top, the opening is on the top, then he says it's a problem. Rava again disagrees for the same reason. Afilu zekifa nami shori. Even if it's upright, it will also be mutter. Why, says Rava? Because me peiros ninhu. Me peiros einan machmitzin. Since the juice that comes out from these stalks or the flour is merely me peiros, there's no issue. And therefore me peiros are not machmitzin, and therefore it's mutter. Tonu Rabbanon, the Gemara brings a brayso ein loitzesin shiur sa'arim b'Pesach. When it comes to taking out the bran, so you can go ahead and beat the grain and make it into more of a fine type of flour, then there's a process called letisa. Letisa means that you soak it lightly, the grain. Over here we're talking about soaking, says the brayso, the barley. So it says in the Brayso, "Ein loitzesin surim b'Pesach." One shall not do that on Pesach. V'im lotos, if he did soak, again, we're not talking about major soak. We're talking about with a little bit of water, enough to cause it moisture, to then beat it out and take out the bran, leaving the white flour, the right grain. Nizbaku asuros. If one did it b'di'eved, so if it then opened up, then it's osir. Then for sure there's chametz. However, lo nizbaku mitaros. However, if it did not split open, then it's mutter. Did not yet come to the stage of chimutz. Rabbi Yossi Omer shoyron bechaymetz v'chaymetz soimson. Rabbi Yossi says if it's going to then swell up, so that will bring about perhaps a leading of chametz to ultimately become nisbaku, he says then pour vinegar on it. That will be ma'akev. That will constrict the process of chimutz, and therefore there won't be a problem. Omar Shmuel ein halach ke Rabbi Yossi. Shmuel says the halach is not like Rabbi Yossi, by putting vinegar that will not constrict and then uphold the process of chimutz. Omar Rav Chizda, Omar Mar Ukva lo nizbaku mamish ela kol she'ilu manichin al pi chavis v'hei nizbaku me'alein. Rav Chizda says that even if it's not actually split, but if you would put it on a barrel of wine, whereby the fumes of the wine would enter that grain and would cause it to be nizbaku, that's enough to be concerned that it will lead to chimutz. It's in stage of problem of chametz, and therefore be aser. Ushmul Amar nizbaku mamish. Shmuel says no, it has to actually split open in order to be then rendered aser. Ovad Shmuel uvda kedura debei bar chashu nizbaku mamish. The Gemara says that indeed Shmuel was asked a question in the kfar, the village of the people called Bei Chashu, Bar Chashu, that's his name, and he paskin that such grain is mutter because it was not split, it was not nizbaku mamish. So we see that Shmuel holds it has to be nizbaku mamish to be osir. Omar Rabbi said, Bal nefesh lo yiltois. Rabbi says somebody who was pious, he has Yirei Shamayim, that person is a bar maila, he should be careful not to even be lot du letisa. Frek the Gemara, what do you mean? My area bal nefesh. Afilu kuli amanam. We saw from the Brisa that your one is not allowed to then do letisa. Answers the Gemara, the Gemara is still asking a question. The hotanya. How can you tell me that it's only a bal nefesh? The hotanya, it says in the Brisa that we quoted, ein loitisin sa'arin ba Pesach. You cannot then do letisa with sa'arin on Pesach. So why you tell me a bal nefesh should not go ahead and do letisa? Answers the Gemara, hachi ka'amar, bal nefesh afilu chitin deshrire lo yiltos. Even when it comes to wheat, which is stronger, and therefore is not as easily absorbing any water, even such a person should not go ahead and do letisa with chitin if he's a bal nefesh. However, that's of course a chumrah, but mi'ikar hadin, when it comes to sorin, a person shall not do letisa, as the Brisa stated, it's osir. Omar le Rav Nachman said, man detzayis le la'abo, one who listens to Rabbah in saying that he shall not go ahead and do letisa even for chitin, but then achil nahama de ipusha, he's going to eat nahama de ipusha. It doesn't mean over here spoiled bread, spoiled matzah. Here it means to say he won't have fine floured matzah because it will be coarse. And therefore we have Amoraim that indeed did do letisa with chitin. The hoki Rav Huna let latisi, ube Rav Bar Avin let latisi. These Amoraim did do letisa with chitin, so that they came out with fine white floured matzah. The Rava Omar, Rava said, now Rava began by saying, Osir liltois. He said it's prohibited to do letisa. Elo hodetanya. Ein loitis in Sa'arim Pesach. Ask the Gemara, what do you mean it's osir? Hare, the Brisa says it's osir to do letisa with Sa'arin, with barley on Pesach. Diuk. Sa'arin hu, the loy have chit is shari. It's only the sa'arin that's problematic, but the chit and the wheat, one can yes do letisa. So why does Rava take on the position that it's osir to go ahead and do letisa? Answers the Gemara on behalf of Rava, lomi boy ka'omar. He was saying a lomi boy. In other words, that which it states in the Brisa that it's osir to do letisa with barley means even with barley, but certainly with wheat. Lomi boy chitin kivan the east bay Syria ali buhumaya aval sari this shi'i a mashapridami. Not only when it comes to chitin has grooves in it, and therefore there the water will then get stuck inside the groove, whereby it'll lead to chametz. So therefore you can't do letisa with chitin, kol shekain, chitin, right? And not only that, but even sa'arim, which is smooth, you cannot do. Kamash malon. So in other words, that Rav is explaining the Bryce is different than the svar we said before, that chitin is hard, and therefore water doesn't enter as much. Here's another svar. He's saying, fakert. He's saying, since chitin has grooves, thereby it's more susceptible from becoming chametz. And nonetheless, not only is chitin going to be also the litisa, but the Brisa says even sa'arin. That's how Rav explains this Brisa, whereby Rav at this point says that it's also to do litisa. Now the Gemara says, Hoda Amar Rava. Rava was chayzer, and he says, mutter lil tois. It's mutter to do litisa. The Tanya, and now he brings a Brisa to support why he was chayzer boy to say that indeed it's mutter to do litisa, because yotzim bepas nekiya v'hadra. One can fulfill his mitzvah of matzah with both pas nekiya and pas hadra. Now nekiya is mashma, that it's white, fine flour. Now l'chara, to get it white and fine flour, l'chara you have to do letisa. Says the Gemara, v'efshar the nekiya below letisa. You can't have clean, fine, white flour for your matzah if it's not done letisa. So from here, Rava says it's mutter. Rav Papa challenges Rava, and he says, "Hakemochim v'hasiltois shel nochrim shel keforim taharim." He brings a brayso that says that the kemach and the soiles, which means not only the regular flour but even the refined flour, that if it's in the nochrim's kfar, that is tahor, meaning to say that it has not come in contact with water, whereby it's not susceptible to tumah, therefore it's tahor. V'shel krochim tameim. However, in the krochim, it's tameim. So presumably it's tamei in the krochim because it did come in contact with water. The kfarim, my time, going back to the ratio, why in the kfarim do we say that it's taharim? Says the Gemara to explain, La Mishum, Rav Papa explains, La Mishum deloy litzi, the kakari le soiles. Is it not because they didn't do litisi, they didn't soak the grain, and still it's called soiles, as the Brisa says, whereby you do have a fine floured type of matzah that's going to be even without letisa, because its Torah didn't come in contact with water to be susceptible to tumah. So that's Rav Papa's a challenge against Rava. Answers the Gemara on behalf of Rava, Targuma Akimcha. You have to explain the Brisa as being going on Kemach. That means the Reisha of the Brisa that says Kfar is Tohor, that's talking about where it's Kemach. Then in Echanami, Lo Letisa was done. No Letisa was done because it's only talking about Kemach. But in the Sefer where Letisa was done, it's referring to the Soiles. There, in the krochim, it is tmeim because it did come in contact with water, and therefore it's susceptible to tumah. Bosar de Nafik, the Gemara says, once Rava left the presence of Rav Papa, he, so to speak, kicked himself, and he said, Omar, my time lo emo le meha. Why didn't I tell Rava a better argument from the following? To explain to him that indeed, that letisa is not necessary to make fine flour. The Omar Rabbi Zer, Omar Rabbi Yirmiyahu, Omar Shmuel, Chitin shel menachos ein loitesin oisam v'kakari luhu soiles. When it comes to mincha, you're not allowed to do letisa. You can't soak those grains to make flour for the menachos, and yet it's called soiles, fine flour. So you see, you can come to fine flour even without letisa. So Rava, you have no proof that letisa is mutter, because otherwise you cannot have soiles nekiya. Hodamar Rava. Now the Gemara says that Rava even retracted a second time. And originally he said that letisa is osir. Then he retracted and said letisa is mutter. And now he once again retracts and says mitzvah lil tois. It's a mitzvah to do letisa. Shneimar brings a pasuk, ushmartem es hamatzos. You shall guard the matzos. Explains, not only guarding it from chametz, but Eloi means also what? Eloi di iboi letisa shimur lamai. What is this shmira that we're talking about? That you shall guard the matzah. Must be that you should guard it already from before that. Ishimor delisha, if it's talking about only the shimor of lisha, when you are adding water and kneading the dough, shimor delisha lav shimor, that's not called shimor, because that's already going to be something, if you're not careful, it'll lead to chametz. So certainly that can't be called shimor. The Omar Rav Huna b'tzeiko shel nachrim, odam memale kreisay mehen, ubilvad sheyoichal k'zayis matzeh ba'achroina. The batzeka, the dough of nachrim, that you can eat it because there's no signs of chametz, but you cannot fulfill your mitzvah of matzah. And therefore, the last kazayis, when you do fulfill your mitzvah of matzah, when you go eat the korban pesach, that will require to be other types of matzah, not from the dough that was received from the nachrim. My time, why can't you? It must be because mishum deloy ovar do'olo ovad bihu shimur, because it did not have shmira. In other words, it's not just good enough that it didn't become chametz. It also had to have an aspect of lishma. Ula abile shimur, asked the Gemara, the afia ve'elach. Then why don't you say that there's a shimur, a fulfillment of the pasuk ushmartem es hamatzos from the time of the baking? In other words, get the dough from the nachrim, and thereby, granted, it wouldn't have the lishma in the time of the kneading, because they didn't do it lishma. But since not any signs of chametz on this dough, now when you bake it, you'll then bake it lishma. Rather, he proves from here that you need shimur from before that. It's not sufficient from that time alone of baking. Umemai asked the Gemara, what kind of proof is that? Who's to say that you need it from the time of baking? Maybe taka, you need it only from the time of lisha. Dilma shiny hasin de ba'ina de nachis lishimur le'avid leshimur. Maybe at the time that you need shimur to mekayim ushmartem samatzos is from the time of the lisha, and since it was nachrim, they didn't do it. Aval hecha de ba'ina de nachis lishmur avid leshimur hachanami de shimur. But when that shimur was necessary and it was performed, then it would be a satisfactory kiyum of ushmartem as hamatzos, the hainu, the time of the lisha have a shimur. So therefore, Rav, it doesn't have to be before that. It should be sufficient from the time of the lisha. Va'afilu hachi, says the Gemara, loy hadar be Rava. Nonetheless, Rava himself did not change his tune, did not change the shita, and he said it has to have shimur from even before the lisha, the kneading process. The Gemara records that he told those who were in the field after the harvest, when they're then finished harvesting, he said them to then pick up and turn over the wheat that they just harvested. Because I want you to do it for the sake of the mitzvah. In other words, it has to have lishma, already from the time of the ktsira. Therefore, we see that Rava's shita is that ushmartem as hamatzos means already from the time of the ktsira all the way down to the time of the afiyah. The Gemara records another Amar who was careful like Rava. Mar Brei de Ravina, on top of Mem Amud Beis at the top. Man kelei imei ba'arbe. It states over here that his mother would take the grains that were just harvested and she would put them in a kli in order to then protect them. In other words, he also held the shita that shimur is required from the zman of the kitzira.